Welcome to Perspectives from HSBC. Thanks for joining us. And now, on to today's show.
Thanks for joining today's episode of our Perspectives series. My name is Dr. Helen Belopolsky. I'm the Global Head of Geopolitical Risk at HSBC. This episode is being recorded behind the scenes of our Global Investment Summit in Hong Kong, where we're delighted to welcome our guest for today, Kim Ghattas. Kim is an award-winning journalist, author, and strategic advisor on geopolitics. She has more than 20 years experience in the Middle East, international affairs, and U.S. foreign policy. She is a renowned expert on the region, having covered the Middle East for the BBC and Financial Times. And if that wasn't enough, she is the author of Black Wave, a New York Times bestseller. Kim, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Helen.
Now, today's conversation is about the Middle East. The Middle East has become a major destination for investors, given the strategic reforms, natural resources, but also the ambitious economic diversification plans. Kim, as we look at the Middle East, we also see multiple shifts and a rebalancing in the politics of the region. The Middle East is in a state of flux. Would you agree that the established status quo politically is changing?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Helen. It's great to be with you on this podcast, and it's great to be at the HSBC conference. The Middle East is a fascinating region. It is full of high rewards, but also high risks. And for investors, it's all about being able to weigh those two. Where is the opportunity for the long-term investment? Where are the short-term risks, and where are the long-term risks? And it's quite a complex image that you end up with. Over the last 15 months, I think two particular trends have been upended, and the status quo is therefore also upended. And those two are also interconnected. So the first one is the dramatic weakening of the Iranian axis, as we call it. So Iran, a major power in the region, not at the same level as Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Egypt, but a major power in the sense that it has had, and probably still has, some ability to spoil other people's plans. And that is therefore a risk for investors, whether it's the nuclear program, missiles, and proxy militias like Hezbollah and Hamas. And over the last 15 months, we've seen Iran's 40-year-long policy of using proxy militias in the Middle East and using countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen as forward defense bases to keep, quote-unquote, the enemy occupied far away from Tehran, the enemy in Iran's eyes being the US and Israel. That policy has, to a large extent now, been exposed as not working anymore for Iran. It has been taken away from them in the aftermath of the Hamas massacre of October 7th against Israelis. Iran suddenly was facing the limits of that policy that it has developed and really perfected over 40 years since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And it has now, it is going to have a very difficult time rethinking how it operates in the region, particularly as, and I know we'll come to this in the conversation, as Trump has set his sights on how to increase maximum pressure on Iran and weaken it to the point that either you get to a new kind of nuclear deal or other deal, or potentially we're looking at renewed strikes against Iran. The other trend that has changed is Israel's mindset. And Israel's mindset in the aftermath of October 7th was really one of trauma, understandably, and choosing to go for military intervention, both in Gaza, but also in Lebanon. And now, over the last year, over the summer of 2024, we saw direct military strikes between Iran and Israel, first time in their history. And we've seen, since the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria in December, we've seen Israel take territory in Syria, take the long coveted Mount Hermon in Syria, which gives them visibility over Syria and over Lebanon. They've expanded their buffer zone. They are moving again militarily inside Gaza. And in Lebanon, they're continuing, despite the ceasefire, to continue with military strikes against targets in Lebanon. So you have an ascendant Israel that has really reestablished deterrence, that has had some strategic military gains. You know, I say this from a purely sort of analytical perspective. And you have an Iran that is weakened.
So Kim, just based on those two trends that you identified, do you see the region being less or more stable?
I think 2025 is going to be chaotic because the players' different agendas are not aligning yet. Iran feels weak but doesn't want to negotiate under pressure with Trump, but they're going to have to because they just don't have the upper hand. You have President Trump's plan for Gaza, the Gaza Riviera, which just doesn't fly with any of the Arab countries and certainly not with the Palestinians. The Arab League plan is valid in many ways. It doesn't have enough guarantees for Israel about how to ensure that Hamas does not rise again in Gaza, but it has some very solid proposals that are a counter proposal to what President Trump is suggesting that would allow the Palestinians to stay in Gaza while it is being rebuilt. I don't know how workable it is. And then you have Israel in this mindset that is somewhat expansionary, and that is going to clash with other Arab countries. So that sets us up for some chaos and some turbulent times. And of course, the biggest concern is Iran's nuclear program. As it feels cornered and under pressure, having lost some of its cards and leverage through the loss of Hezbollah and Hamas and others, is it going to accelerate its nuclear program as leverage, knowing that that can also accelerate strikes against it? But I don't want to paint only a doom and gloom picture because there are real opportunities.
Now, just turning to your first book, which was groundbreaking, Black Wave, really crystallized the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which have evolved the order in the region. How do you see the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran evolving in the next few years?
So, Black Wave charts how Saudi Arabia and Iran became rivals and how that changed the region from a social, cultural, and religious perspective. So it's grounded in the geopolitics of how that rivalry unfolded after 1979, because we need to remind your listeners that before 1979, Iran and Saudi Arabia were friendly rivals. They were allies that were competing, just like other powers in the region or in Europe or elsewhere. And 1979 is really what triggered the rivalry, because Khomeini wanted to become not just the leader of Iran, not just the leaders of Shias, but the leaders of all Muslims around the world. And in the times that we're living in today, I just want to make that quick point before answering your question. What I explore over the course of the book is how the region changed over time, slowly, gradually. Norms and values were changed and eroded, and it took people quite some time to realize the extent of the transformation. Saudi Arabia, after having a first few years under King Salman and Crown Prince Salman that were quite rocky, where Mohammed bin Salman really wanted to establish himself as, a powerful leader in the region, launching a war against Yemen for, you could say justifiable reasons or not, but he did that, imposing an embargo on Qatar, which, really roiled the Gulf and must have been quite difficult to navigate for investors and others, has now sort of matured in his approach to foreign policy and playing quite a deft game, I think, in the region. And that starts with going for a détente with Iran in 2023, March 2023, a détente which was absolutely essential to protect his ability to focus, Mohammed bin Salman's ability to focus on Vision 2030. Because the tension was rising so much again between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and we had seen some strikes by the Iranians via proxies against oil fields in Abqaiq, for example, in Saudi Arabia, but also against the UAE. The Houthis still using missiles. And Saudi Arabia just decided that it needed to pull the rug under those efforts. And it went for détente with Iran. And Iran was also feeling a lot of pressure. So it was convenient for Iran as well. And I suspect that the Saudis will want to maintain that and make sure that they keep their rival on their good side. You know, you keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And I think that is very much the vision that Saudi Arabia has at the moment. And for Iran, I think that just as Russia would like to take Ukraine out of the European orbit, out of the NATO orbit, with the help of Iran, because these two crises overlap on Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran in the region is trying to make sure that Israel doesn't enter the Arab orbit, and it wants to interdict further normalization deals between Israel and its Arab neighbors, namely Saudi Arabia. So you have these real sort of clashing visions for what is the future of the region.
You've mentioned President Trump quite a bit over the course of the past few minutes. Just curious about how you see his perspective. Does he have a strategy for the region? What does it tell us about the evolving role of the international system, given how prevalent him and Mr. Witkoff have been in negotiations?
President Trump has a lot of ideas, and when one doesn't work, he goes to the next one, even if they're in direct contradiction. I worry that we're going to see chaos in the region also because some of these plans are not well thought out. And when you're making policy, you really need to have a well thought out plan. You need to game it out. How are all the players going to react? I mean, you know, whether you're an investor or a policymaker or you're doing acquisitions, you need to understand the mentality of all the players, what is workable, what is not. What's the backup plan? What are your contingencies and where are the risks? And I think President Trump is just coming up with these grand ideas. You know, Gaza Riviera sounds great, but it's not a business deal. It's not a real estate deal. There are human beings. I guess he didn't ask the other stakeholders, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, what did they think about it? So to construct any kind of vision, you really need that bandwidth, that planning, and the nitty-gritty knowledge of the details. And I think that is lacking at the moment in how the Trump administration is approaching the Middle East. And now, you know, we'll talk about Iran still, I'm sure. You know, they want a deal with Iran. So they want to put maximum pressure on Iran, and they want to try to get some kind of nuclear deal. The contours of that are very vague. We don't know what Trump has in mind. And the fear amongst many Iran hawks is that the obsession with getting a deal will lead to a weak, bad deal.
Well, maybe that's a perfect segue into Iran. Do you anticipate a deal, or do you anticipate a preemptive strike by Israel on Iran? It's a challenging question.
It is a very challenging question, and I'm not trying to sort of, give you a cop-out answer. But I think this is really something that we're going to have to watch week by week, month by month. Because, as I said earlier, Iran is at its weakest. It wants to negotiate, but it's just not going to give up all its leverage. Iran maintains some air superiority over Iraq at the time. It's an interesting hypothetical scenario. So today, is Israel going to carry out a preventive strike against Iran's nuclear capabilities? It's possible. I think it's definitely a possibility. I think it depends on how President Trump negotiates that. If they get to a deal, what are the details? What is the trust but verify? What is the IAEA role? What do the other Arab countries think of it? The UAE is positioning itself as the interlocutor on this one, just like Saudi Arabia is the sort of, host for the Ukraine-Russia crisis or war talks. The UAE is likely to be the negotiator, or the host at least, for those US-Iran talks. But Iran is not going to give up its nuclear program without some solid guarantees. And would you really believe President Trump's guarantees at the moment? I think it's going to be a difficult, difficult square to circle. But I want to add one more point. I think that Iran could agree to a two-state solution if Israel would make that move. And that's something that is an opportunity that was missed in the aftermath of October 7th. I think Iran was ready to agree to a lot for the sake of survival, and we've missed that opportunity. And I know a lot of people say, no, that's not possible. Iran wants to eradicate Israel. I think they're much more pragmatic than that.
And you've touched on the Gulf, the UAE and Saudi. Be curious to know what you think. There's been a lot of speculation about friction between the UAE and Saudi over the years. Some of that has been tempered over the course of the past couple of years. Where do you see the relationship between the UAE and Saudi going over the course of the next few years?
So as one UAE diplomat told me when I was visiting recently, Big Brother has woken up. Saudi Arabia, Big Brother. The UAE lives kind of under the shadow of Big Brother. But also the UAE is far more advanced in diversifying its economy, in attracting, foreign direct investment, in being a massive hub for travel through Dubai Airport, 83 billion passengers a year. I think 12 billion of foreign direct investment in 2023. It's a big market. It's very attractive. It's very easy to operate in the UAE. And Saudi Arabia is trying to catch up with that. And Mohammed bin Salman has made huge progress over the last few years as he tries to take his country into the 21st century, because it was really lagging behind. I've covered Saudi Arabia since 2003, and I've seen the transformation very rapidly over the last five years, with some definite downsides when it comes to political expression and oppression. But I think that these two countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have a lot of divergences and a lot of competition between them. But that is the kind of competition that also drives growth and investment. There's a lot of opportunity. There is a healthy competition when it comes to the economic level. Saudi Arabia wants to outdo the UAE. It also wants to become a hub of travel, over 100 million passengers by 2030. They've attracted 500 large companies setting up their headquarters in Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, the UAE is much more advanced in the services that it provides, in the lifestyle that it provides. But I think it's a healthy competition. I think it drives growth and investment. But there is political rivalry.
We're sitting in Asia at the moment. We've seen a huge increase in the corridor between Asia and the Middle East over the course of the past few years. Curious as to whether you think October the 7th and the return of Trump might actually alter the pivot to Asia.
You mean back to the Middle East?
Well, the Middle East back to the U.S.
The U.S. never left the Middle East. China is very much there as a commercial partner, as an investment partner, as a host of, to finalize, entente agreements between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But I don't see China having a real political role. I don't think they want a political role at the moment, and they don't have the leverage, neither over Iran nor really over Israel, which is interesting. Israel, America's closest ally, Iran, America's foe. They don't really have the leverage. They can be the guarantor to some extent of the détente agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran doesn't want to upset China either. But China doesn't have that kind of leverage yet in the Middle East. And I know that I've said as well in our conversation that local regional actors are kind of driving the momentum in the region. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, Iran. But the US still plays a central role, and I don't see that being replaced yet, if only because of, armament, weapons. Israel buys, is key buyer of American armaments. Saudi Arabia wants that as well. The defense industry in the US is, kept going in part also in large part by the Middle East. So I don't think that is going to change. And there is, an ingrained culture in the Middle East, perhaps more so than in other parts of the world, to say, what does America want? What does America think? Well, what should we do about America? What should we say to America? And I don't think that will change. I do think that the American pivot to Asia keeps being thwarted by crises in the Middle East. The Biden administration wanted to pivot to Asia, was working very hard on it. And then October 7th happened, a month after Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, said, the Middle East has never been more stable. Famous last words, really. I mean, you should never predict that the Middle East is going to get boring or stable. And that brings me to the issue of the Palestinian state. Having a Palestinian state or a promise of a Palestinian political horizon or a political horizon for the Palestinians isn't going to resolve all of the Middle East's problems, right? It is not going to resolve tensions between Turkey and Israel. It is not going to, put to bed our concerns about Ahmad al-Shari'a's real intention. It is not going to resolve the corruption in Egypt. It is not going to resolve the dictatorship tendencies of Qais Saidi, but it's going to remove a key irritant, a real element that aggravates everything.
Kim, one final question, and hoping to end on a bit of optimism or hope. You've mentioned opportunities a number of times. Who are the economic winners? Where are the opportunities in the Middle East?
I would love to say that the opportunities are, in my own country, Lebanon. Maybe some good real estate is there to be had. The tourism industry is going to start booming again. But, the pound has devalued so much. I guess that does bring opportunities. You can still buy assets cheaply, but you need to have a long-term risk tolerance. The debt in Lebanon is massive. We still don't know how it's going to be restructured. It all depends on the new central bank governor, what his vision is, whether we're going to get, an IMF plan, etc. And in Syria, I think Syria is a great test case of how you rebuild after conflict. And so while it is perhaps not necessarily an immediate opportunity, it is one that investors need to watch. It's a small market, but it's a big reconstruction project, a bit like Gaza, right? Estimated at $56 billion according to the Arab League plan. So there are opportunities there. Some of them are small, but some of them are potential long-term, good sort of down payments for longer-term investments. I mean, CMA-CGM is very busy, including in Syria. So they can see the vision, the opportunity. If I were an investor, I'd be worried about some countries where the political climate is, difficult, uncertain, too much debt, too much spending on big, vanity projects. I would stay away from those. But the Gulf is, I think is the big opportunity. And Iraq, I would say Iraq is an underestimated market. It comes with its risks as well. It has been very close to Iran. It relies on China a lot, but I think there's a lot of room there. As Iraq tries to peel itself away from Iran to some extent and sort of, play really quiet so it doesn't get caught in the crossfire, I think there are some big opportunities there. It's a big market. It's undertapped. Oil, electricity, infrastructure, tourism, I think that's a big one.
A huge thank you, Kim, for your candor, for your knowledge, and it's helping us understand, navigate some of the complexities, but also identify the opportunities in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Perspectives. Make sure you're subscribed to HSBC Global Viewpoint to stay connected